This is not just a portfolio. It's a complete digital experience designed, engineered, and redefined to do one thing: impress at first scroll. Whether you are a client, a recruiter, or a fellow dev, you're about to enter a handcrafted world built with code, design, and vision. In today's dev world, your portfolio is more than a resume. It's a product. It tells you a story, it proves your skills, but most importantly, it converts interests into action. So this walkthrough isn't just a showcase. It is a masterclass in building interactive, responsive, and scroll reactive UI using the stack I love: React, Tailwind CSS, GSAP, and more, layered with precision. You will notice something right away. This portfolio moves. It doesn't wait for you, it interacts with you. From the 3D animated hero, hoverable projects, and scroll-bound macro motions, every section is alive, and it is not just aesthetics. It is intentional. Every animation is there to guide the user's attention. Every spacing choice measured. Every transition crafted. In this video, you will get a front row seat to every design choice. By the end of this video, you will know how to build it all, and more importantly, why it works. We kick things off with a bold 3D hero section. A spherical planet descends from the top, wraps in a golden ring that rotates with cinematic smoothness. As it lands, our main headline gently rises from below, giving users that wow moment as soon as they land on the page. At the top right, a sleek menu icon triggers the navigation bar. With one click, it slides in from the right, smooth and responsive. Inside, section links fade in with staggered animation. Next, the service summary section subtly introduces our core skill. As you scroll, each word animates horizontally, guiding the eye and building rhythm. It's all about layering meaning with motion. In the service section, each card elegantly slides upward into view, from full stack development to DevOps and mobile apps. Every service is presented with a minimal, clean design paired with smooth macro interactions. In the section, here's where we humanize the brand. The About section features a portrait revealed scroll animation. Beside it, text animations line by line sharing a bit of the persons behind the code in a personal, modern way. This section brings projects to life. Each hover triggers a dynamic overlay with preview images. Interactivity is key here. Users can engage visually before they even click. And if you're wondering how I built this hover effect from scratch, stick around for the code breakdown at the end. Before we wrap up, the contact summary sets the tone for collaboration, with a smooth horizontal marquee featuring key values like excellence and innovation, and a powerful quote to inspire action. Finally, we land on the contact section. Subtle animations reveal email, phone, and socials, while a marquee wraps the experience with a signature message. Just imagine I code. It's clean, memorable, and a perfect finish. So that's the full breakdown of this immersive portfolio. Every scroll, animation, and interaction was crafted with purpose. And in this video, I will show you exactly how to build these sections line by line. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know what kind of project you want to see in the next video. So first and foremost, we are going to create a new project. So I'm just going to create a new folder, and I'm going to name the project Awwwards-portfolio. And then we're just going to simply open this folder into the VS Code. All right, here we go. In order to set up our project in a fast way, we got to use Vite. So just simply click on the Get It Started button, and if you scroll down, we're just going to simply copy this. And for that, it requires Node.js version 18 plus or 20 plus. And let's head back to VS Code. Let's open up the console and just simply place it right here. And for project name, I'm going to say /. I'm going to choose React, JavaScript, and let's run npm install. All right, now once it is installed, we need styling. So for styling, we are going to use Tailwind CSS. So we are going to the documentation using Vite tab, and then we're just going to follow the instruction. So in here, we're just going to simply copy the npm install Tailwind CSS and Tailwind CSS/Vite. Then let's head back to VS Code. I'm gonna paste it right here. So I'm going to put my browser and Visual Studio Code side by side so that you guys can see it better. All right, here we go. Now we got to configure the Vite plugin. So for that, we need to head the vite.config.js file and add these two highlighted sections. So I'm just going to copy the import Tailwind CSS, and let's head back to vite.config.js file and just simply paste that right over here. And also we're going to copy the Tailwind method and paste it within the bracket. All right, here we go. And after that, we got to import the Tailwind CSS into our CSS file. So just simply copy this and head to the src and then index the CSS file. Right at the top, I'm gonna paste it right here. Here we go. And after that, we gotta start npm run dev. We can see that if everything is working properly or not. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it in the command line. Here we go. Now we gotta run the localhost 5173. Here we go. You can see that everything is working properly. Now we need to check if the Tailwind CSS is working or not. So for that, I'm gonna head to app.jsx and I'm just going to simply change this title color. So in here, I'm gonna give it a class name of text-red-500. Here we go. Tailwind CSS is actually working. So the main problem here is that if I hover my mouse over this Tailwind CSS class, you can see that my Tailwind CSS IntelliSense is not working right now. You can see that the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense has been installed. If I scroll it down, it is saying that for version 4, inside .css file, we got to import the Tailwind CSS style sheet. For example, @import Tailwind CSS. So we already done that, but why it is not working? So it is a minor bug. So we gotta restart the VS Code and we are good to go. All right, here we go. Now you can see that this class name has been identified. All right, now we are done configuring our Tailwind CSS and our project. So the next thing that we gotta do is do some cleanups. We're going to clean some folders and files that we don't need to use throughout our project. So for that, I'm just gonna simply delete the app.css because we already have the index.css file. So let's delete that. And also we don't need to use the assets folder. Here we go. And then also we are not going to use the vite.svg. So let's delete that as well. So inside the app.jsx, I'm just gonna simply remove everything. And then in here, I'm just gonna run refce. If you guys wondering what is refce, refce is a React component that actually allows us to spin up React component pretty fast. You can easily head to the extensions and in here search for React snippets, and the first result is the simple React snippets. Here we go. This is the React snippets, and these are the shortcuts that you can use to create React component. Okay, in the index.css file, I'm just going to remove everything except the @import. Here we go. Now for styling, I'm just going to copy my index.css file, which contains some fonts, class names that actually we can use to create the project. So I'm just going to simply copy all of those codes and paste all of those right here. Now you can see that it contains some fonts and custom colors, also configuring the website color, background, and stuff like that. And then we also have the custom Tailwind classes. There we go. All right. And the next thing that we're going to add is the public section. So for public, we're going to add, I'm just going to copy all of those necessary folders. You just guys can simply get it from my GitHub repository. Now in the public folder, you can see that we have assets folder and the background. These are some images and some project images and some fonts that we're going to use in this project. And this is a 3D model that we're going to use for our hero section. All right. Now we are done configuring the project folders and structures. And now we are ready to create a award-winning portfolio. All right, the first thing first that we got to do, we are going to start with the navigation bar. So for that, let's open up the Explorer, and in the src folder, I'm just going to go ahead and create a new folder, and I'm going to call it sections. And after that, within it, let's create a new file again, and let's call it navbar.jsx. And in here, let's run refce. Here we go. In order to see the result, we are going to add this component into app.jsx. So let's head back to app.jsx, and within this div, I'm just simply say navbar. Here we go. Now we can see the navbar right here. All right, now let's do some modification on the app.jsx. So let's give this div a class name of relative w-screen in order to take the full width of screen, min-h-screen to take the full height of the screen and overflow -x hidden in order to get rid of those ugly horizontal scroll bar. All right, now let's head back to the navbar.jsx and let's delete this div element, nav, and then let's define a class name of fixed, since it is always on top, and z-50 in order to make it over other the elements, and also give it a flex -call, justify -between, w-full, h-full, and padding x of -10. Let's make it uppercase, and let's say bg-black and text-white-80, and let's say padding y-28, gap-y-10. And for medium and large devices, make the width half of the screen, and also say left -1/2, which is the 50% from left. Now, if I make my browser bigger, you can see that it is taking the half of the screen. All right. We can also give this nav a ref so that we can use it later for GSAPAnimation. So in here, I'm going to define a ref, const nav ref equals to use ref, and then I'm going to define it null. In here, I'm just going to simply say ref equals to nav ref. Here we go. Now within this nav, let's create a div, and this div will going to have a class name of flex-call, and also text-5xl, gap-y-2, and for medium and large devices, make it text-6xl, and also for larger devices, make it text-8xl. All right. Now within this div, we're going to have some sort of navigations. What I mean by navigations, I mean the home link, services, about, work, and contact. So let's define those. So in here, let's define an array. I'm going to say home, and then services, and then about section, and then we have work and the contact dot map, and we will call the callback function here, and then it'll take the section and an index, and it'll return a div. All right. Now within this div, I'm going to define the navigation links. So right now within this div, we can define an anchor tag, just like so. Let's define a class name actually as well. Let's say transition all with a duration of 300, and let's say cursor dash pointer in order to make the cursor pointer, and then let's say hover text dash white. Now as you can see, if I hover over a link, you can see that it is smoothly going to transition. All right. Now for this div, let's define key of index, and then we can also define a ref for each and every single one of them in order to make them animated. So for that, right at the top, I'm going to define a ref, const links ref equals to use ref and array type. In this div, I'm just going to say ref equals to an arrow function, and it'll take an element. This element represents current element, which is this div, and then I'm going to say links ref dot current with the current index equals to element. So right now we are going to store current element into links ref dot current with that specific index. All right, there we go. After this div, let's create another div for our contact information, for example, email address and social media's link. So for that, let's define a div, and I'm going to make it flex. Define a class name of flex-call, flex-wrap, justify between, and gap-8, and we can also say MD for medium and large devices, make it flex-row. And let's define a ref for the contact information as well. So let's say contact ref, and let's define it right at the top. So here I'm going to say const contact ref equals to use ref null. There we go. So after that, within this div, I'm going to define another div, and within this div, it'll have two types of paragraphs. So the first paragraph is the email, and the second one is your email address. For example, johndoe@gmail.com. And let's give this div a class name of font-light. And also for the email, I'm going to say class name of tracking-wider, and also say text-white/50. For the second paragraph, I'm going to call a class name of text-xl, and let's say tracking-widest, and then make it lowercase. And we can finally say text-pretty. All right, below this div, we'll define another div for our social medias. I'm just going to simply say a paragraph with the social media. So for this div, I'm going to define a class name with font-light again. And for the social media, I'm going to define a class name of tracking-wider. And let's define text-white/50 with the opacity of 50. And after that, let's define another div in order to load up our social media's link and the names. So for that, we need to iterate through our index.js file, which we are going to import right now. So first, let's define a div and let's define a class name of flex-call and make it flex-wrap. For medium and large devices, make it flex-row with the gap-x-2. All right, now let's import the index.js file. So let's open up the Explorer, and in the src folder, let's create a new folder, and I'm going to call it constants. And then in here, I'm just going to simply get index.js file and paste it right over here. In the index.js file, you can see the services data, which will be used in the services sections that we're going to provide to our customers. And then we have projects that will be used inside the projects. And finally, it is the socials link. For example, the Instagram, the YouTube, LinkedIn, or whatever social medias that you are using. So let's head back to navigation bar.jsx. And within this div, I'm going to iterate through the socials. Socials.map callback function, and it'll take once social with the index, and it'll return an anchor tag. In here, I'm going to say social.name. There we go. And let's define some styling, and let's define a key first, key of index, and let's define a class name of text-sm leading-loose tracking-widest, and let's also make it uppercase. And then also we can add curly brace in order to make it beautiful, just like so. Here we go. We can also give it a hover text-white in order to make it hoverable and beautiful. Right now, let's give it a transition colors with a duration of 300. There we go. We can also give it a href. So let's say below this key, I'm going to define an href of social.href. There we go. Now we have defined the social medias. All right, the next part that we got to build is the burger icon. So first, let's wrap this navigation inside a JSX fragment. I'm going to copy this and paste it right over here. And then after the nav element, we're going to create a div. And let's define a class name of fix z-50 flex-call. Let's define items-center, justify the center, gap-1 with transition all, duration of 300, make it bg-black, rounded-full, cursor-pointer, and w-14, h-14. And for medium and large devices, make the width of 20. And also for medium and large devices, make the h of 20. And let's define top-4 and right-10. So it is going to be appear on this side. Now within this div, let's define a span, and then I'm going to define a class name of block w-8 h-0.5 bg-white rounded-full and origin-center. There we go. Now let's copy all of this and paste it here in order to make it duplicate. All right, so far so good. The next thing that we got to do is defining a ref for this first span and the second span, because we are going to animate it into the cross sign. This is currently a burger icon, and whenever the user clicks on it, it is going to change a X sign or cross sign. So for that, I'm going to define this first span a ref of top line ref, and for second span, I'm going to define a ref again, and this time I'm going to say bottom line ref. So in here, I'm going to say const top line ref equals to use ref null const bottom line ref equals to use ref with the null value. Here we go. Once we have defined all of those refs, we are ready to define the GSAP animation for our navigation. So for that, let's open up the console, and in here we got to create a new terminal, just simply clicking on the plus sign. And then in here, I'm just going to run npm install GSAP at gsap/react. All right, there we go. Now, once it is installed, we're going to animate the navigation, which is the black screen right here. First thing first, we are going to setting up the stage so that we're going to prepare our elements for animations by setting their initial states. Think of this like positioning actors before the play begins. In here, I'm going to use GSAP hook and then let's define an arrow function again. And then in here, I'm gonna set GSAP. Make sure first import the GSAP. GSAP.set. I'm gonna say navref, which is the entire navigation. Navref.current x%, make it 100. So what does that mean? It means that hide the entire nav off screen to the right, just like so. That we have already done this. And after that, let's define gsap.set. I'm gonna say array linksref.current, and then contactref.current, and then we're gonna say auto alpha to 0, and then make it x minus 20. So what is auto alpha? Auto alpha is a shortcut for opacity and visibility. So auto alpha 0 means opacity 0 and visibility hidden, and x minus 20 means that push 20 pixels to the left. And after that, we need to create the main navigation timeline. This would be our main navigation sequence for the navigation menu. So let's define gsap.timeline and then make it pause to true. The reason why we made this pause true is that we create a pause timeline that we can play/reverse later. So we will control this manually with our menu toggle. So what I mean by that, when the user clicks on this menu icon, animations will going to start, all right? So in here, I'm gonna say .2, we're going to slide in the entire nav from right to center. So in here, I'm going to say navref.current, and then we're going to make the x% 0. And then with the duration of 1 second, with ease of power3.out. This has actually worked the best. I've tried this before. And x% 0 means that animate to 0%, make it fully visible, with the duration of 1 second. So this GSAP twin, the two navref.current, will going to slide in the entire nav from right to center. And after that, we're going to animate the navigation links. So let's define .2 again, and then this time we're going to select the linksref.current, and then in here I'm going to say auto alpha to 1, x0, stagger of 0.1, with the duration of 0.5, and with ease of power2-out. And then also we can actually give it a positional parameter because we want to start this animation at the same time with this animation. Since they are in a timeline, we can give this a positional parameter by saying this sign. It means that start this animation at the same time as the previous one, which is this one. So they both going to start at the same time. And finally, let's define .2 for the contact section. So in here, I'm going to say .2 contactref.current, and then let's say auto alpha to 1, x0 with the duration of 0.5, with ease of power2.out. I actually forgot to explain what is a stagger. Staggers means that each link animates 0.1s after the previous ones. I'm going to show you that later. So first, I'm going to comment this out so that you guys can see it, okay? So stagger means each links will be animated after 0.1 seconds. So first, this one will be animated, and 0.1 second later, the services, and then after that, the about, work, and contact. All right. Now, let's also give this a positional parameter of plus 0.2. This means that it starts 0.2 seconds after the previous animation starts. All right, now once we have defined this GSAP animation, we can also set this into a variable so that we can use it later. So in here, I'm going to define a const TL equals to use ref null. And then in here, I'm going to say TL.current equals to this one. Now we have assigned this animation to this TL.current. All right, now let's create a open and close state so that we can see this animation that we have implemented so far. So I'm just going to remove these comments. All right, now let's add the open state so that user can open and close it. So in here, I'm just going to simply say const is open, set is open equals to use state. And for initial value, I'm going to say it false. All right, after the use GSAP, I'm going to create a new function, which is called toggle menu. Const toggle menu equals to an arrow function again, and then I'm going to say if it is already opened, we got to make the TL.current, which is the variable that we have assigned the animation. As you can see, the GSAP animation that we have created into this TL.current, and then we are using it right here. TL.current, if the menu was already open, make the animations reverse. There we go. Otherwise, if it is closed, just like now, make the TL.current play. And then we're going to set is open to opposite of whatever that is. There we go. And then we need to assign this into a onClick event. Let's scroll down right at the end, onClick toggle menu. So right now when the user clicks on this burger icon, you can see that it is smoothly going to open up. And whenever I close it, you can see that the GSAP animation is actually working properly. And this is for the desktop version. Now we got to add this burger icon and animation in order to make it even beautiful. If the user clicks on it, I want to convert this into a cross sign. So inside this use GSAP animation, after this tl.current, I'm going to create another animation. So let's define a GSAP.timeline again. And then we're going to call pause to true, because we don't want to start the animation on its own. We just want it to control over it. And then let's define .to, and let's say top line ref rotated 45 degree with y of 3.3, duration of 0.3 seconds with ease of power 2 dot in out. Here we go. It means that rotate 45 degree clockwise. We are trying to convert this into a X sign. And then we have y 3.3, which means move down slightly to center the X. And then we have duration of 0.3 and power 2 dot in out. It is representing the smooth acceleration or declaration. Okay, and then after that, for the bottom line, we're going to say .to bottom line ref .current, and then this time we're going to rotate it minus 45 degree with the y-axis of minus 0.3 with the duration of 0.3 with ease of power 2 dot in out. And then we're going to give it a positional parameter by saying this sign, which means start it at the same time. And then finally, we can give this use GSAP hook an empty dependency array, which means this only runs once when components mounts. And then let's assign this entire animation into a variable so that we can use it inside the toggle menu. Just like the previous one, I'm going to define const icon timeline equals to use ref with a null value. And icon TL, I'm going to copy this and paste it right here. Icon TL.current equals to GSAP timeline. Here we go. Now we are done with use GSAP. Inside the toggle menu, we can say icon tl.current.reverse. If it is closed, I'm going to say icon tl.current.play. Here we go. Now whenever we start clicking on the burger icon, let's refresh it first. Oops, something went wrong. You can see that one of them is working at least. All right, so let's check. All right, I forgot to add the current. Top line ref.current. Here we go. And let's refresh it again. Now we can see that it is animated properly. All right, the final touch that we need to make is that whenever the user scrolls down, I want to make this invisible. And whenever user scrolls up, make it visible. All right, so for that, let's define some sort of state by saying const show burger set show burger equals to use state. And for initial value, I'm going to make it true. Let's show it. So after the use GSAP, I'm going to create a use effect, define a callback function. And after that, we're going to define window.addEventListener scroll. And then we're going to define the handle scroll. And then let's say passive to true. This is optimize scrolling performance. And after that, for cleanup, I'm going to say return an arrow function, window.remove event listener, scroll, and then handle scroll. And let's define the empty array. It means that run this only once on mount. All right, now let's define the handle scroll function. So right at the top, I'm going to define a const handle scroll equals to an arrow function. And then in here, I'm going to say const current scroll y equals to window.scroll y. And let's define the last scroll position to determine the direction. I mean, we are going to track the last scroll position to determine the direction. So first, I'm going to say let last scroll y equals to window.scroll y. And then within this function, I'm going to call the set show burger. And then we're going to say show the burger menu when scrolling up. So how we can say that? So we're going to say it like this. Current scroll y is smaller equal than last scroll y. Or at the very top of the page, we are going to say current scroll y is less than 10. It means that we are at the very top of the page. And finally, we're going to update the last scroll position for the next comparison. So in here, I'm going to say last scroll y equals to current scroll y. Here we go. And let's define the show burger into burger icon. So in here, I'm going to define a style. If show burger was true, make the opacity 1 or visible. Otherwise, make it hidden. So this time I'm going to use clip path because it is more beautiful than typical changing the opacity values. So for that, I'm just gonna head to the browser and search for the clippy. In here, you can find different shapes, different paths that you can use in order to make your website more beautiful. So for that, I'm going to use the circle one. In our example, if show burger was true, make it visible just like this. Otherwise, make it hidden. So it is going to be like this, smoothly going to be animated. So let's say show burger and then clip path. Just to find a clip path and then with this circle. I'm just going to copy this clip path and then paste it right here. And then otherwise, I'm going to use this clip path, hide it, make it 0% in order to be accurate. Here we go. Now, if I head back to the project, if I scroll down, there is no space in order to scroll it down. So let's create some space. So for that, let's head to the app.jsx and below this navbar, let's create a section. I'm going to make it self-closing as well. And then let's define a class name of min-h-screen. I'm going to make it 2 times. All right, here we go. Now you can see the scrollable screen. If I scroll down, you can see that it is hidden. When I'm scrolling up, it make it visible. Here we go. And now when you click on it, it is smoothly going to show the navigations. And this is also for the desktop. Here we go. And the final touch that we need to consider is whenever the user clicks on links, it is going to suddenly jumps to that specific point. So we don't want to be like that. So in here, instead of using this typical a link, we're going to use React scroll component. So let's open up the command line, and in here, I'm gonna run npm install react/scroll. After you have installed it, I'm gonna give some fake sections. For example, I'm gonna give this ID of home and ID of services. All right, now if I click on, let's give this an href. I forgot to add the href here. So let's say href of section. Now, if I click on the service section, you can see that it suddenly jumps to that section. We don't want that. If I make it bigger, so we don't want that jumping. Okay, so if I give it a background color, you can see it properly. BG- for example, 900. Did you see that? It suddenly changes the sections. We don't want that. So let's fix that. All right, let's get back to the navbar. What we are going to do is we're going to replace anchor tag with this link from React scroll. Here we go. And instead of using href, link has a property which is called to, and then it doesn't need to use the hashtag anymore. And then also make it smooth and make it offset equals to 0 with the duration of 2 seconds or 200 milliseconds. If I make this bigger, now if I click on the sections, you can see that it is smoothly going to change the section. All right, here we go. Now we are done creating the navigation bar. The next section that we are going to build is the hero section. In this section, we are going to use a 3D model and header text, and we are going to start animating them by using GSAP. So first of all, we got to create a new component. So let's open up the Explorer, and in the sections folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it hero.jsx. Let's close the Explorer, and in here, I'm going to run refce. Let's remove the React. All right, now let's add this component into app.jsx. So below this navbar, I'm going to add hero.jsx. Now you can see the hero right here. And after that, I'm just going to go ahead and remove these 2 sections because we don't need it anymore. So let's head back to hero component. And then I'm going to replace this div with section. So let's say section. And then this section will have a class name of flex-call justify-end min-h-screen in order to take the full height of the screen. And also let's give this section an ID in order to make this section navigatable. ID equals to home. Here we go. And within the section, I'm going to go ahead and create a div, and then I'm going to give this div a ref because we are going to animate this with GSAP. Ref equals to context ref. Let's define this context ref. So right at the top, I'm going to say context ref equals to use ref. And for initial value, I'm going to say null. Make sure you import the use ref right at the top, just like so. And within this div, let's create another div. And this time, this div will going to have a style equals to clip path. So let's head back to Clippy website, and I'm going to choose the third one, which is the polygon. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy this polygon and then paste it right here. The reason why we are using this clip path is that everything that is outside of the clip path will going to be invisible. In other words, we are trying to create a mask. I'm going to show you guys later what is the reason why we are creating this clip path. So within this div, I'm going to create another div again. And then this time, this div will going to have a class name of flex-call, justify-center, and then make it gap-12 and padding top-16. And finally, we gotta say for small and large devices, make the gap-16. Here we go. And then let's also give this div a ref. Ref equals to header ref. Let's define this header ref. So in below this context ref, I'm gonna call const header ref equals to use ref. For initial value, I'm gonna say null. Here we go. And then within this div, I'm gonna define a paragraph, and then within it, I'm gonna say 404 no bugs found. And then let's give this paragraph a class name of text-sm font-light tracking dash 0.5 rem uppercase padding x-10 and text-black. Here we go. And below this paragraph, let's create another div, and within it, I'm gonna define a h1. And within the h1, I'm gonna write my name. Here we go. And let's give this div a class name of padding x-10. And for the h1, I'm gonna say class name of flex-call, and also make it flex-wrap. And then let's say gap-12 text-black uppercase banner-text-responsive. So this is just a custom Tailwind CSS class name in order to make the text responsive for any devices. And then let's also say, and for small and large devices, make the gap-16. And for medium and large devices, make it block. And after that, I'm going to collapse this div, which contains the style clip path. And then below this div, I'm just going to go ahead and create another div. This div will have a class name of relative padding x-10 and make it text-black. And within this div, I'll create a self-closing div in order to create a line. So this div will have a class name of absolute inset-x-0 border top-2. All right. Now below this div, let's create another div, and then I'm going to define a class name of padding y-12 for small and large devices. Make the padding y-16 and text-in. And within it, I'm going to define a paragraph. And let's define a class name of font-light, make it uppercase, value-text-responsive. And within the paragraph, I'm going to say, I help results-driven webs or apps. There we go. So right now, as you can see that this is a plain text. You cannot start animating each line based on the breakpoint that it has. So for that, instead of using this paragraph, I'm going to convert this into a separate component. In the src folder, I will create a new folder, which is called components. And in the components folder, I'll create a new file, which is called animated text lines.jsx. Let's collapse the explorer. And in the animated text line.jsx, I'm going to run refce. Let's remove the React import. Here we go. And this animated text line will take some properties. And the properties are text and a class name. And after that, we are going to split the text by line breaks by saying const lines equals to text.split, and then we're going to say each break line that it has dot filter, and we will call the callback function line.trim not triple equal to empty. And after that, let's give this div a class name of class name, and then let's also define a ref in order to start animating it. Ref equals to container ref. So right at the top, I'm going to say const container ref equals to use ref null. And within this div, I'm going to iterate through the lines by saying lines.map, and it'll take each line with index and it'll return a span, and then I'm going to say line. All right, let's add this component into hero.jsx so that we can see the result. Now I'm just going to go ahead and convert this paragraph to a animated text line. Animated text lines, and let's make this self-closing tag. Here we go. Now I'm just going to go ahead and copy the text, and the right at the top, I'm going to define const about text equals to that text line. And then let's add this about text in here by saying text equals to about text. All right, here we go. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to define the breakpoints. So let's make it bigger in order to see it better. And then in here, I'm going to say I help growing brands and startup gain, and I'm going to hit enter on for advantage through premium. I'm going to define it through premium and hit enter right here. Here we go. And let's head back to animated text line in order to start adding the GSAP animation. Before adding the GSAP animation, I'm going to give the span a class name of block leading dash relax, tracking dash white. I'll also say text dash pretty. And also let's give this span a key of index. And let's also create a ref for each and every single line by saying const line refs equals to use ref. And for initial value, I'm going to say this is an array. And below this key, I'm going to say ref equals to, again, an arrow function, and take this current element. And for the return, I'm going to say line refs dot current with current index equals to element, which is basically saying that import each and every single element into line refs. Now we are ready to add the GSAP animation. So right at the top, I'm going to use GSAP hook, which is going to take a callback function again. And in here, I'm going to say if line refs dot current dot length was larger than 0. In other words, we can say only animate if we have lines to animate. So within the curly brace, I'm going to say GSAP. Make sure to add the GSAP properly. There we go. GSAP dot from lines ref dot current, and then within the bracket, I'm going to say y100 with the opacity of 0. Make the duration 1 and stagger 0.3, and with ease of back dot out. And let's also add scroll trigger by saying scroll trigger, and then we're going to say trigger it when container ref dot current enters to the viewport. So let's explain what is going on into this GSAP. We are using the animation by saying start 100 pixel below final position, which is final position is right here, and we're going to start at 100 pixel below final position. I'm going to set it to invisible with duration of 1 second and 0.3 delays between each line, with ease of bouncy easing at the end. So right now, if I refresh it, oh, and don't forget to import the scroll trigger. First of all, we need to register it by saying gsap.register plugin scroll trigger from gsap/all. Here we go. And then let's refresh this page. You can see that each line has been animated. Let's make it bigger so that you guys can see it properly. If I refresh the page, you can see that each line has been animated. All right, now we are done with animated text lines. So let's head back to hero.jsx, and in the hero.jsx, we are going to animate the subtitle and the title itself. So for that, right at the top, after the about text, I'm going to create a use GSAP hook by saying use GSAP. And in here, I'm going to go ahead and create a new timeline by saying const TL equals to GSAP dot timeline. And then we are going to create the first animation by saying TL dot from, and then we're going to select the context ref dot current. And within the curly brace, I'm going to say y of 50 viewport height, which means starts 50% viewport height below with duration of 1 second and with ease of circ.out. Now, if I refresh the page, you can see that it is smoothly going to animate it from bottom to center. And after that, for the second animation, let's define TL.from, and this time we're going to select the header ref.current. So where is the header ref? Header ref is actually within this div, the clip path that we have already defined. So what does this clip path do? If I give this div a class name of border, you can see that everything out of this border going to be invisible. For example, if I give this div a translate y of 20, you can see that it is invisible outside of the polygon. And then we are going to make this text visible by using this mask. So let's head back to use GSAP, and then in here, TL.from header ref.current, and then we're going to create the curly brace of opacity to 0, and then y 200. And then we're going to say with the duration of 1 second and with ease of circ out. Now, if I refresh the page, you can see that everything outside of this polygon will be invisible. Here we go. Now let's give this a positional parameter in order to make this animation even more beautiful by adding this sign plus 0.2 seconds, which means that start 0.2 seconds after previous animation begins. So if I refresh the page, you can see that it is smoothly going to show up the title. All right, now after that, I'm gonna give this use GSAP a empty dependency. Here we go. Now I'm just gonna go ahead and remove this border. Now if I refresh it, now we can see that everything is working properly. And this would be much more beautiful in a desktop version. If I refresh it, beautiful. All right, now we are done animating the text line and the header text. So after that, we are ready to add the 3D model. I'm just gonna go ahead and collapse this div, and then below this div, I'll just create a figure. And then I'm gonna give this figure a class name of absolute inset dash 0 and minus z dash 50. And also I'm going to give this a style with width of 100 viewport view and height of 100 viewport height. And within the figure, we are going to use ThreeJS elements. So for that, we got to install 3D components by opening up a terminal. And then in here, I'm going to run npm install 3 at react-3/fiber at react-3/Drei and react-responsive in order to make the 3D model responsive. And finally, we're going to install the math. Let's hit enter. Now, once it is installed, we are ready to use ThreeJS. So within the figure, I'll create a canvas from React 3/Fiber. And then I'm going to give this canvas a shadow in order to make the shadow enabled. And then I'm going to give this a camera with position of 0, 0, -10. And let's also give this a FOV of 17.5. with near value of 1 and far value of 20. And within the canvas, we are ready to add the 3D model. So let's open up the Explorer, and you can see that in the models folder, I have already added the planet.glb, which is the 3D model that we're going to use. So how we can use this 3D model into React component? So first of all, we need to convert this planet.glb into a usable React component. So basically saying we got to convert this glb file into JSX file. So there is a website for that. In a browser, you just simply search for convert gltf to JSX. And then you click on the first result, which is going to ask you simply drag the file, and then you will get the JSX file. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag this glb file, and you can see that it is loading, and voila, this is your converted JSX file. And the final tweak that we got to make is to change this location. So currently we are using the models planet.glb, so we got to add the model prefix before the slash. So let's open this up, and in the path prefix, I'm just going to go ahead and simply say models. Let's hit enter. Now you can see that the location has been changed. All right, now I'm just going to go ahead and copy all of this. And in the components folder, I'm going to create a new file. And in here, I'm going to say planet.jsx and paste all of those code right here. And then let's change this model into a planet. Now let's add this component into hero.jsx. So within the canvas, I'm going to simply say planet. Here we go. Now, if I head back to the project, you can see that everything is dark. So in 3D environment, we need to use light in order to see the object. So right above the planet, I'm going to create a lighting by saying ambient light. And then we got to give this intensity of 0.5. And after that, let's add some studio lighting by saying environment, and then let's define a resolution of 256. And within the environment, let's define a group. And within the group, I'm going to define a light former. All right. Now I'm just going to go ahead and give this group a rotation of math.pi divided by 3. And for z-index, I'm going to give it at 1. And let's give this light former a form of circle and intensity of 2 with position value of 0, 5, and -9. Now you can see a small lighting circle has been appeared right here. And then let's scale this circle up, adding a scale of 10. There we go. Now let's duplicate this for 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And then let's change the positions. I'm going to say 0, 3, 1. And for the third one, I'm going to say -5, -1, and -1. And then for the last one, let's give this 10, 1, 0. And let's change the scale to 16. Here we go. Now you can see the lighting studio is hitting the planet. Here we go. Now we can also give this planet some sort of floating effect by saying float from React Three Drei, and then let's wrap this planet inside a float. There we go. Now we can also give this float a speed of 0.5. That's better. Now this is the stunning 3D model that we have created. All right, now the next step is we got to make this 3D model responsive. So right at the top, I'm going to create const is mobile equals to use media query from React responsive. And then let's say max width is 853. So when it reaches below 853, we are making the 3D model responsive. And for the planet, I'm going to add scale equals to, if it is mobile, we use 0.7, otherwise default value, which is 1. We can actually tweak this value if we want. For example, make it even smaller or make it even larger if we want. Now this is very large. It is up to you. After that, we're going to give this planet GSAPAnimation. So let's head to the planet.jsx, and inside the planet.jsx, we are going to define some ref. in order to use animation for our planet by using GSAP. So first of all, I'm going to give this group a ref. I'm going to say ref equals to shape container. So right at the top, I'm going to say const shape container equals to use ref with null value. And then also we are going to group the two spheres, which means that I'm going to group this circle and the second circle together so that we can use ref. So here we have the sphere and we have the second sphere. All right, if you want to know which is the gold one and which is the white one, you just simply change the value. For example, I'm going to give the scale of 1. So this mesh is the goldish mesh. So I'm going to return it back. So in here, I'm just going to copy this and move it right above this mesh, which is the ring mesh. Here we go. And then I'm going to wrap this two mesh inside a group by saying group, cut this group, and then paste it right over here. And after that, I'm going to give this group a ref by saying spheres container. Let's add this right at the top by saying const spheres container equals to use ref. For initial value, I'm going to define it null. And finally, we're going to give this ring, which is the goldish ring right here, a ref as well by saying ref is equals to ring container. Now let's add it right at the top by saying const ring container equals to use ref. Now we are ready to use GSAPAnimation. So right above the return, I'm going to create a use GSAP hook. And within the curly brace, I'm going to say const TL equals to GSAP. Make sure to add it properly from GSAP.timeline. Now let's start creating first animation by saying TL.from. I'm going to select the shape container, which contains all of the shapes, .current.position. I'm going to select their position. And then in here, I'm going to say Y5. It means start 5 units higher, with duration of 3, with ease of circ.out. And if I refresh the page, you can see that it is coming from the top to the center of the screen. After that, let's create the second animation by saying TL.from, and this time we are selecting the spheres container .current.rotation. Now we are trying to rotate the spheres by saying x0 means starting rotation on x-axis, and then we're going to select the y-axis of math.pi, and let's also give the z-axis of minus math.pi, and then let's say with duration of 10 seconds with ease of power1.inout. All right, now let's refresh the page. You can see that it is coming from the top to center, and after that it is start rotating. Let's add positional parameter in order to make this rotation start with the previous animation by saying minus equals to 25%. Let's add the colon here, which means that I start this animation when the first one is 75% complete. And after that, let's add the third animation by saying TL.from, let's say ring container .current.rotation, and let's say x 0.8, y of 0, and z of 0. And let's give it a duration of 10 seconds with ease of power1.inout. And we can also give this positional parameter as well. And then let's say starts simultaneously with the previous animation. Now, if I refresh the page, we can see that when it reaches to the center, the ring and spheres start animating simultaneously together. Also, we can give this an empty dependency array. Here we go. Now, in the desktop version, you can see that if I refresh the page, it is smoothly coming from the top to the center, and the spheres and the rings start animating all together. Beautiful. Now we are done creating the hero section. The next section that we are going to build is the service summary section. In this section, I will create a short, straightforward, and summarized service section that will showcase some of the key services that you're going to provide. So in order to achieve that, let's open up the Explorer, and in the sections folder, I will create a new section, and I'm going to call it service summary.jsx. And in here, I'm going to run refce, and after that, just like before, I'm going to go ahead and remove the import React from React. And after that, let's add this component into app.jsx. And below this hero section, I will add the service summary. All right, now let's head back to service summary component, and let's close up the Explorer. And then I'm going to go ahead and close up some of the tabs that we don't need to. All right, here we go. Let me scroll it down. You can see the service summary is right over here. All right, now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to replace this div with section. And I'm going to give this section a class name of margin top -20, overflow -hidden, font -light, leading -snug, text dash center margin bottom dash 42, and finally contact dash text dash responsive. There we go. And within this section, let's go ahead and create some text. I'm going to define a div, and then within it, I'm going to say paragraph, and within it, I'll say architecture. All right, now let's scroll it down. Here we go. So after that, we will going to animate this div. So what I'm going to do next is, instead of using ref, this time I will use ID so that you guys can see it. GSAP actually works with the ID as well. So I'm going to give this ID equals to title dash service dash 1. Now after that, below this div, let's create another div, and then I'm going to give this div an ID of title service dash 2, and then this div will have a class name of flex items dash center justify dash center gap dash 3, and let's also say translate dash x dash 16. All right, now within it, let's define a paragraph, and then I'm going to say development, and then below this paragraph, let's create a self-closing div. In here, I'm going to define a class name of w-10 h-1. For medium and large devices, make it w-32 and bg-gold in order to create this beautiful dash. And below this div, I'll define a paragraph again, and this time we will say deployment. And let's give this first paragraph a class name of font-normal in order to make it bolder. All right, now below this div, let's create another div, and this time I'm going to give this an ID of title service dash 3 with the class name of flex items dash center justify dash center gap dash 3 again minus translate dash x dash 48. And within this div, I'll define a paragraph, and then I'm going to say APIs, and then we got to use the dash that we have created in here. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it right below this paragraph. And after that, let's create another paragraph, and then I'm going to say front ends, because front ends is one of our services that we're going to provide. And let's define a class name of italic. And after that, I'm going to use the dash again, and below it, let's create another paragraph by saying scalability. Here we go. All right, now below this div, let's create another div again, and then I'll give this div an ID of title service dash 4. And let's define a class name of translate dash x dash 48. And within it, let's create a paragraph again. And then in here, I'm going to say databases. Here we go. Now let's start animating these divs that we have created so far. So right above this return, I'll create a use GSAP hook by saying use GSAP. Here we go. And then within the curly brace, I'm going to define GSAP. Make sure you add it properly from GSAP dot to, and then I'm going to select the title service 1 by using hashtag title dash service dash 1, and then within the curly brace, let's define x% 20, which means move right by 20% of element's width. And after that, let's define scroll trigger. Make sure to add this scroll trigger so that we can use it. So right above the service summary component, I'll create a GSAP.register plugin. And then for the parameter, I'm going to say scroll trigger from GSAP/all. There we go. And then in here, I'm going to define a curly brace, and I'm going to choose the target of hashtag title dash service dash 1. And then I'm going to define a scrub, and then I'm going to set it to true. There we go. When the title dash service dash 1, which is this div, reaches to the viewport, it will be animated based on the scroll position. While the animation is tied to the scroll position, it'll go 20% to the right side. And let's define another animation. So I'm just going to copy this and then paste it for 3 times. So 1, 2, 3. Here we go. Until you have 4 GSAP animation. And then I'm going to change the service dash 1 to 2. And for the third one, I'm going to say 3. And for the fourth one, I'm going to define 4. Let's change the x percentage. For the second one, I'm going to define it minus 30. For the third one, let's say 100. And for the last one, I'm going to say minus 100. Let's save it and let's refresh the page. You can see that the third animation is not working properly because we actually, I think, mistyped the service. Yeah, we mistyped the service. Here we go. Let's refresh it again. Now you can see that everything is working properly. So as you can see in this component, the animation is actually acting a little weird. So there is a reason behind this. You cannot actually observe the third title and the fourth title properly because the scroll position has been reached at the end. Basically saying the scroll position has been reached to the 100%. And this is actually makes sense that since it is 100% completed, so the X percentage will move 100% as well. So you can see that it is off the screen. While if you add more sections, you will get smooth result. So we can actually try this by heading to app.jsx, and below the service summary, I'll create a section, and then I'm going to define a class name equals to min-h-screen. And then if you duplicate it for several times, so right now, if I refresh the page, you would see a smooth result. Let's refresh it. Now you can see it. When I'm scrolling down, you can see that the third and fourth title is not off the screen. There we go. All right, now I'm just gonna remove all of the sections because later on we're going to add real sections. All right, oh, there's a minor issue that we have. You can see the horizontal scrolling right now. Maybe I mistyped the overflow X hidden. So let's head back to service summary, and then, yeah, right over here, I actually missed out the W. So let's fix that. Here we go. Now you can see that we actually get rid of the ugly horizontal scrolling. Right now, after that, the next section that we are going to build is the actual service section. In this section, we are going to provide detailed information about the services. So for that, let's open up the Explorer, and in the sections folder, I'll create a new file, and I'm going to call it services.jsx. And then in here, I'm going to run refce. As usual, I'm going to remove the import React from React, and then I'll add this component into app.jsx. So let's head back to app.jsx, and right below the service summary, I'm going to add the services section. Here we go. Now let's head back to services.jsx. Now you can see that the services is right over here. And after that, I'm going to replace this div with section. And then I'm going to give the section an ID of services. And then let's define a class name of min-h-screen bg-black. Let me scroll it down so that you guys can see it. Here we go. You can see the black screen. And after that, I'm going to say rounded-top-4xl. There we go. Before I proceed to create this project, let me show you the finalized version of the project. You can see that the service section is actually using the container that we actually used in the hero section right over here, but with different details. So basically saying we got to use this container. So instead of duplicating ourselves, why not make this as a separate component so that we can use it in other sections? So let's do that. I'm gonna open up the hero.jsx, and then we need to cut all of this div, which contains the subtitle and a title and a value block itself. So I'm just gonna collapse this div, and then I'm just gonna copy this div. And then let's open up the Explorer, and in the components folder, I'll create a new file, and I'm gonna call it animated header section.jsx. And then in here, I'm gonna run refce. And after that, I'm going to replace this div with the div that we have cut from the hero.jsx. Here we go. And after that, let's add this component into hero.jsx. So in here, I'm going to say animated header section. And after that, I'll going to cut the use GSAP hook and its related refs. Let's cut this out. And then I'm going to head back to animated header section.jsx. And right above the return, I'm going to paste it right over here. And then after that, we need to import the dependencies. So let's head back to hero.jsx. And then we've got to use the GSAP, use GSAP, and animated text line, and actually use ref. So I'm going to cut this out again, and let's head back to animated header section, and right at the top, I'm going to paste them right over here. Here we go. All right, now we need to make the subtitle and a title and value block dynamic. So let's do that. So right over here, I'll create an object, and then I'm going to define the properties. So I'm going to say subtitle and a title and a text, and let's also define text color as well, because as you can see right here, the background is black. So we got to make our text white. So let's define text color as well. All right, now let's implement those. So instead of using this hard-coded text, I'm going to cut this out, and then I'm going to replace it with subtitle. Go. And as well as for this one, I'm going to say title, and then right over here, I'm going to define text right here. We go. And after that, we got to implement the text color. So every element that contains the text -black will be replaced with that property. So let's do that. So in here, we got to make this class name a dynamic string. Here we go. And then let's change the text dash black into $ text color. Now we've got to do the same thing with the h1 tag as well. Go now, let's remove the text dash black. Let's do the same thing with this. I'm going to wrap this. Here we go. And let's also do for the animated text line. I'm going to copy this and paste it right over here. And then here we go. So I'm just going to copy this about text, and then I'm going to hit back to here.jsx, and then I'm going to leave it right here. And let's change the variable name to text because the previous one wasn't use a proper naming. And after that, I'm going to define a subtitle equals to 404 no bugs found. And let's define the title of Ali Sanati. And let's define a text for the value block. I'm going to define the text as well. Here we go. And after that, let's define the text color. I'm going to say text dash black. Here we go. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to copy the animated header section, and then let's head back to service.jsx. And then I'm going to paste it right over here. And after that, let's import the animated header section. Here we go. And then let's define the text. So right above the return, I'm going to say const text equals to I build secure growth, not headaches. There we go. Now if I scroll it down, you can see the text right over here. All right, now let's change this text color to text dash white. And then let's change the subtitle to behind the scene, beyond the screen. And after that, let's change the title to service. Here we go. If I refresh the page, you can see that the animation is already initialized on a first refresh. So we don't want that. We want this section to be animated when user reaches to this section. So how we can do that? It is simple. We just need to implement the scroll trigger. So let's head back to animator header section, and then inside a GSAP.timeline, I'm going to define a parameter of scroll trigger. Right over here, I'm going to define a curly brace, and after that, I'm going to define a scroll trigger. And then in here, I'm going to define ternary f. So first of all, we got to implement the property. I'm going to say with scroll trigger, and then let's define the initial value of false. And then I'm going to copy this, and then in here, I'm going to say if with scroll trigger was true, trigger it when the viewport reaches the context ref.current. Otherwise, do nothing. Let's make it undefined. All right, now let's add the with scroll trigger to the service.jsx. So let's head back to service.jsx, and then in here, I'm going to define with scroll trigger, and then I'm going to set it to true. If I refresh the page, you can see that this animation has been initialized. And if I scroll down, and you can see that this section will be animated when user reaches to the section. All right, after that, before we continue on creating this section, let's make the scrolling effect smoother. As you can see, we are using the default scrolling animation, which is not actually smooth enough. You can see that if I'm scrolling up and down, it is jumping. So in order to make this scrolling effect smoother, we got to use Lenis. So what is Lenis? Lenis is a lightweight, robust, and performant smooth scroll library. By using this, you are making your scrolling smoother. So let's install this. So let's open up the terminal, and let's create a brand new terminal. And then in here, I'm going to say npm install Lenis. Now let's head back to app.jsx because we are trying to implement it for all of our sections. So let's head back to app.jsx. And then instead of using this normal div, I'm going to replace it with React Lenis. And then let's define root property. Here we go. And then if I refresh the page, and then you can see that the scrolling is much more smoother than the previous one. Beautiful. Right now we are ready to continue on creating the service section. So let's head back to service.jsx, and then below this animator header section, we got to iterate through the service data that located in index.js. So first we got to import the service data by saying import service data from constants. And after that, below this animator header section, I'm going to iterate the service data dot map, and it'll take service with index, and it'll return a simple div. There we go. And after that, I'm going to define this div a ref because later on we're going to use this for animation. So right above the return, I'm going to define const service refs equals to use ref, and for initial value, I'm going to define it as an array. All right. Now after that, I'll give this div a ref equals to a callback function, and then that are going to take an element, which is the current element. And then let's define service refs dot current with the current index equals to this element. And after that, I'm going to define this div a key equals to an index, and then let's define a class name of sticky padding x-10, padding top-6, padding bottom-12, text-white, background-black, and border-top-2, and let's define border-white/30. Here we go. And then within this div, I'll go into define another div, and then let's define a class name of flex items-center justify between gap-4 and font-light. And again within it, let's define another div with a class name of flex-call gap-6. And within it, I'm going to define the h2 tag, and then I'm going to say service.title. Here we go. And then let's define a class name of text-4xl. And for large devices, make it text-5xl. And below this h2 tag, let's create a paragraph, and then let's say service.description. And let's define a class name of text-xl leading-relaxed tracking-widest. And for large devices, make the text-2xl, and let's change the text color to text-white with the opacity of 60. And then let's say text-pretty. And below this paragraph, I'll define a div, and then I'm going to define a class name of flex-call gap-2 text-2xl. And for smaller and larger devices, make the gap-4. And larger devices, make it text-3xl and text-white/80. And within it, let's iterate through the service items by saying a curly brace service.items.map, and it'll take each and every single item with item index, and it'll return a div again. And let's define this div a key. Scroll the browser down, and let's define a key equals to a dynamic string of item dash $, curly brace index dash, again $ with the curly brace of item index. Here we go. And then let's define the h3 tag, and then let's define this h3 tag a class name of flex, and then within it let's define the span, and then let's say 0 item index +1. And after that, let's define this span a class name of margin right-12 text-lg text-white/30. And then below the span, I'm going to say item with this title. There we go. And below this h3 tag, I'll create a line by defining a self-closing div, and then let's give this class name of w-full and h-1 pixel and margin y-2 and bg-white/30. All right, now let's remove the final line. I'm going to define a if by saying item index. If the item index was lower than service.items.length -1, then use this line. There we go. Now, as you can see that we already defined a sticky, so we got to make this top-0. Here we go. Now it is beautiful. Let's create a sticky animation for desktop mode. So right at the top, right above the return, I'm going to define a const with isDesktop is equals to use media query, and then let's define the mean width 48 rem, which is 768 pixel. So when it reaches to this 768 pixel, it is going to be considered as a desktop mode. So right below this class name for the first div, I'm going to define a style equals to, if it is desktop, I'm going to use top, and let's define a dynamic string of calculator calc 10 viewport height plus $, with current index times 5. And after that, I'm going to define a dynamic margin bottom, and then let's define a $. Let's say service data. I'm going to take the service data dot count or length, and with index -1, and let's multiply by 5 rem. Otherwise, use top 0 for mobile devices. So let's remove this top-0. Here we go, which is going to stick on the top-0. And if I make it bigger, you are going to see a different result. You can see that it is going to stack on each other, but with specific spacing. Beautiful. So what is this going to do? It is saying that if it is a desktop mode, we are defining a position for each service progressively lower. So if I make it bigger, you can see that each service position is lower than the others. And top-0 is for mobile version. You can see that it is going to stack on each other, but this time without spacing. All right, now let's define the GSAP animation in order to make each of these services animated. So right at the top, I'm going to define a use GSAP hook. And within the curly brace, I'm going to say service refs.current, and then I'm going to use for each loop in order to iterate through each and every services. And it'll going to take the element. And then I'm going to define a curly brace. And then within it, I'm going to define if the element doesn't exist, then return. And then let's define the GSAP. Make sure you add it properly. GSAP.from, and then we're going to select each and every element, and then let's animate each and every single one of them by saying y of 200 and with scroll trigger, and then I'm going to say trigger it when the viewport reaches to this element. And then let's define the start position of top 80%, and then let's define the duration of 1 with ease of circ out. And then finally, I'm going to define the dependency array. Here we go. Now, if I refresh the page, you will see that each section will going to move from 200 pixel to the current position. Beautiful. All right, now we have completed this service section. The next section that we are going to build is the about section. All right, the next section that we are going to build is the about me section. For that, let's open up the Explorer, and in the sections folder, I'll create a new file, and I'm going to call it about.jsx. And then in here, I'm going to run refce. And after that, I'm going to remove the import React, and let's add this component to app.jsx. So let's head back to app.jsx, and right below the services, I'm going to define the about section. There we go. Now let's head back to about component. Let's close the Explorer. And after that, I'm going to replace this div with section. There we go. And then let's define this section an ID of about. And after that, it'll have a class name of main-h-screen, bg-black, and rounded-bottom-4xl. If I scroll it down, we can see the black screen that we have created. All right, now within the section, let's define the animated header section. And then let's say subtitle equals to code with purpose, build to scale. And then let's define the title of about, and let's define the value block text, say text. So right at the top, I'm going to define the text. Right above the return, const text is equals to passionate to production. All right, now you can see the text is right here, but we need to change the color. Text color to text-white. Here we go. And then finally, we're going to define with scroll trigger to true. There we go. And then below this animated section, I'm going to create a div, and then let's define a class name of flex-call items-center justify-between gap-16. And let's also say padding x-10 padding bottom-16 text-xl font-light tracking-white. For large devices, make it flex-row, and for medium and large devices, make it text-2xl, and for large devices, make the text-3xl. Finally, let's define the text color of text-white/60. And then within this div, I'm going to create a image with this RC of images/man.jpg. And then in here, I'm going to say man, and let's define a class name of w-md rounded-3xl. And also let's define this image a ref, because we got to animate this later by saying ref equals to img ref. So right at the top, I'm going to define const img ref equals to use ref. I'm going to define it null for initial value. Let's scroll it down. There we go. And after that, right below this image, I'm going to define the animated text lines. And then after that, I'm going to define the text equals to a about text. So right at the top, let's define this about text. So right above const text, I'm going to say const about text is equals to, I'm just going to simply copy the text and then paste it right over here. You can actually change this text based on your background. Here we go. And let's also define a class name of w-full. All right, now let's add this image and animation. So right at the top, let's define a use GSAP hook. And within the curly brace, I'm going to define a GSAP. Let's import it properly, .to, and then I'm going to choose the about section, about. And then let's define the scale of 0.95. And then let's define the scroll trigger. And then within the curly brace, I'm going to say trigger it when it reaches to the about section. And then let's define the start position of bottom 80% with end of bottom 20%. We scrub animation to true. I'm going to set the markers to true so that you guys can see it, what is going on. And after that, I'm going to define the ease of power1.inout. Let's refresh the page. And I'm going to explain it later what it does. So now let's start adding the animation for the image. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to define gsap.set, and then I'm going to say imageref.current, and then let's define a clip path of polygons. So for that, I'm going to head to the Clippy website again, and then in here I'm going to choose the polygon. After that, I'm going to bring all of those points to the bottom, just like so, and then I'm going to copy the polygon and then paste it right over here. And after that, I will create another GSAP animation by saying gsap.to, and then I'm going to select the imageref.current, and then let's define the clip path, and then I'm going to go ahead and make this fully visible. And then copy this value and paste it right over here. And then let's define the duration of 2 seconds. And then let's say ease of power4.out with scroll trigger. And then in here, I'm going to say trigger it when you reach the imageref.current. There we go. Now let's head back to the project. So right now, if I refresh the page, you can see this beautiful animation. There we go. Beautiful. And after that, let's explain this. What is this? Let's head to the app.jsx, and then in here, I'm going to create more space in order to make it scrollable. So let's add the section, self-close the section, and then let's define a class name of h-screen, and then let's duplicate it for several times. There we go. So let's head back to about.jsx, and you can see that it is saying that trigger this about section, this entire about section, and when the bottom of the section reaches 80% of the scrolling position, which is right over here, it is going to start scaling down. And when the end of the section, which is the bottom of the section, reaches the 20% of the viewport, the animation will finish, just like so. And you can actually observe it in the desktop mode. Let's refresh it again entirely so that you guys can see it. Here, there's a problem with the text right now. And then let's scroll it down. You can see that everything pops up smoothly. All right, now let's modify this value block of animated header section. So if I head back to animated header section, and then in here, right over here, we got to define a space. Here we go. Let's refresh it again. Beautiful. All right, now let's set this markers to false. So let's head back to about.jsx, and then in here, I'm going to define the markers to false. There we go. Let's refresh it again. Beautiful. The next section that we are going to create is the works.jsx. So in this section, we're going to showcase some of the projects that we have done for our clients. So for that, let's open up the Explorer, and in the sections folder, I'll create a new file, and I'm going to call it works.jsx. And let's run rfce. There we go. Now let's remove the import React, and let's add this component into app.jsx. Right below this about section, I'll just add works. There we go. Now let's head back to works component, and then I'm going to replace this div with a section, and then I'm going to give this section an ID of work, and then let's define a class name of flex-call min-h-screen, and within the section, I'm going to add the animated header section component by saying animated header section. There we go. All right, now instead of typing all of these properties, let me head back to the about.jsx, and then I'm just going to go ahead and copy this animated header section. And then let's head back to works.jsx, and then I'm going to paste it right over here. And then right above the return, I'll define a text, const text equals to featured projects that have been impacted. Here we go. And then let's change the text color to text-black. Nice. And then let's change the subtitle to logic meets aesthetic seamlessly. And then let's change the title to works. Let's check it out for this version. Beautiful. Now below this animated header section, I'll create a div, and then I'm gonna give this div a class name of relative flex col font light. And then within this div, I'm going to iterate through the projects that we're going to import from index.js. So right at the top, I'm going to import projects from constants. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call projects.map, and then it'll take each project with index, and then it'll return a div. There we go. And then let's define this div a key equals to project.id, and then let's define the id equals to project for later animation, and then let's define a class name of relative flex col gap-1 and padding y-5 cursor pointer, make it group for animation purposes, and let's say md gap-0. Let me scroll it down. Here we go. Now within this div, I'll create a title. Let's add the comment. I'm going to say title, and then here I'm going to define a div, and then within this div I'll define the h2 tag, and then within it I'm going to say project.name. There we go. And then let's give this h2 tag a class name of lg text-32 pixel, and for mobile devices let's define text-26 pixel, and let's say leading-none. Below this h2 tag we're going to use icon. So the icon that we are going to use is from Iconify. So let's install the related package for that. So in the browser, if you search for Iconify and then click on the React, you're just gonna simply copy this, and then after that I'm gonna open up the terminal, and then I'm gonna paste it right over here. All right, here we go. All right, now after you have installed it, let's close the terminal, and then we gotta find the desired icon. So for that, I'm gonna click on the burger icon right over here, and then let's click on the icons. And then in here you see a variety of icons. So the icon that we are going to use is arrow up right, and then I'm going to choose this one for example, and then let's click on the components tab, and then what we're gonna do is simply copy this icon. And if you pay attention closely, we can actually define the icon name right over here. So I'm just gonna simply copy this, and then let's import the icon from Iconify, and then I'm gonna paste it right over here. Here we go. Now if I head back to the project, you can see that the icon has been defined. All right, now what I'm gonna do is I'm going to remove this width and height because we're going to define a class name for that. So let's do that by creating a class name of, for medium and large devices, make it size -6, and for mobile devices, make it size -5. There we go. And after that, I'm going to define this div a class name of flex justify -between padding x-10 text-black, and let's define the transition -all with duration of 500 milliseconds for medium and large devices, which is basically saying for this sub mode we're going to define the hover effect by saying group-hover, and whenever you hover over a project, make the padding x-12. And let's also define another group hover for making text-white. All right, here we go. Now if I make the browser bigger, you will see that when I start hovering over a project, the animation kicks in. There we go. And then below this div, the title div, I'll create a divider. So let's add the comment by saying divider. Here we go. And then in here, I'm going to define a self-closing div. And then let's define this div a class name of w-full h-0.5, and let's make it bg-black with opacity of 80. There we go. And right below this div, let's create another div for related frameworks that we have done for the project. So in here, I'm going to define the framework comment, and then let's define a div, and then within this div, I'm going to iterate through the project.frameworks.map, and then I'm going to take each and every single framework, and it'll return a paragraph, and let's say framework.name. Here we go. Now let's define this paragraph a key equals to framework.id, and then let's also define a class name of text-black with transition/colors with duration of 500. And for medium and large devices, let's define group dash hover text dash white. Here we go. Now let's define this div, a class name of flex, and then let's say padding x dash 10 text dash extra small leading dash loose, make it uppercase as well, transition dash all with duration of 500. And let's also say for medium and large devices, I'm going to define text dash small gap dash x dash 5. And for medium and large devices, make the group dash hover padding x dash 12. Here we go. All right, now let's check out the desktop mode. There we go. Now you can see the text is transitioning to the white. All right, now after that, we're going to define project images. So right below this div, I'm going to create mobile preview images. So let's define a div, and then I'm going to define this div a class name of relative flex items dash center justify dash center padding x dash 10. And for medium and large devices, make it hidden because we don't want to see it in a desktop mode. And then let's define the height of 400 pixel. There we go. And then within this div, I'll create the image. And then for src, I'm going to define project dot background image. There we go. And then for alternative, I'm going to say string manipulation. And then in here, I'm going to say $ of project dot name and dash, for example, I'm going to say background bg dash image. And then I'm going to go ahead and give this image a class name of object dash cover w dash full, make the h dash full and make it rounded dash md. And finally, I'm going to say brightness of 50 in order to make it darker. And below this image, I'll create the another image. And for the src, I'm going to say project.image, which is the actual image of the project. And then for alternative, I'm going to say dynamic string $ project.name dash image. There we go. And then let's define this image a class name of absolute bg dash center padding x dash 14 and then rounded dash xl. There we go. And as you can see that we have defined for the mobile view project preview images. All right, now we need to define the desktop version as well. All right, I'm going to close this project.map, and after this iteration, I'm going to create a div. And let's add the comment of desktop floating preview image. So we are trying to create a floatable image. If I make the browser bigger, whenever a user tries to hover over a project, a related image pops up. And then we are trying to make this floating image follow our mouse cursor whenever a user move his mouse around. All right, now let's head back to VS Code, and then I'll give this div a class name of fixed minus top dash 2/6 and left dash 0 and z dash 50. And then let's also make it overflow dash hidden border dash 8. Let's make the border black, pointer dash event dash none w dash 960 pixel. For medium and large devices, make it visible, otherwise make it hidden. And then let's also add opacity dash 0. So at this moment, I'm going to remove this opacity because we're going to add this opacity dash 0 for animation purposes when we are using GSAPAnimation. So I'm just going to remove this for the moment. And within this div, I'll define an image with source of projects. And for the index, I'm going to define, for example, 5 for the moment, dot image. And then alt equals to preview. And let's add the class name of object dash cover w dash full and h dash full. Now you can see that the project image has been appeared right at the top. So for the moment, I'm going to make this top dash 0 because we need to see it properly. And then I'm going to turn this back into top 2/6. So I'm going to say top dash 0 for the moment. There we go. So the next thing that we're going to do is make this floating image dynamic. So whenever users start hovering over a project, the related image of that project will show. So let's implement that. Now let's head back to VS Code. And then in here, we got to make this index dynamic. So we got to define a state. So right at the top, I'm going to use useSS in order to create a use state snippets. There we go. And then I'm going to say current index. And for the initial value, I'm going to define it null. There we go. Now let's make sure add the use state properly. There we go. Let's scroll it down. All right. All right. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to get the current index whenever a user start hovering over a project. So we gotta define an event which is called mouse enter and mouse leave. All right, now let's open up this projects.map, and then for this div, I'm going to define on mouse enter, and then we're going to call the callback function, and then we will create the handle mouse enter, which will take the current index. And let's also define for the mouse leave, and then we're going to say handle mouse leave with current index. All right, now let's define this methods right over here, right above the return. And then I'm going to say const handle mouse enter equals to, which will going to take an index. And then within the curly brace, I'm going to define if window dot inner width was below 768, just return it. Don't run this function. So basically saying run this handle method when we are in a desktop mode, because in mobile version we don't have hovering effect, we don't have any mouse cursor, and when we don't have a mouse cursor, so there is no floating image. So right below this, I'm going to define set current index with the index. Here we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and copy this and paste it right over here, and this time we will define the handle mouse leave, and let's set it to null. All right, now after that, let's scroll down, and then in here we gotta make this index dynamic by saying current index, and then we gotta show this image when we have the current index. So let's define a ternary operator by saying current index. If the current index is not triple equal to null, then show this. I'm gonna cut this and paste it right over here. There we go. So let's scroll it down. Now you can see that a related project image will show. There we go. After that, we're going to define GSAPAnimation to our floating preview image so that it pops up smoothly, not suddenly. So I'm going to give this div a ref equals to preview ref. And then right at the top, right over here, I'm going to define a const preview ref equals to use ref. And I'm going to set it to null. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a handle mouse enter. So whenever the mouse got entered, let's create a GSAP dot to select the preview ref dot current, and then I'm going to make the opacity back to 1, and let's define the scale of 1 with duration of 0.3, and then with ease of power 2.out. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this GSAPAnimation, and I'm going to paste it for the mouse leave. So whenever the mouse cursor was leaving, make the opacity back to 0, and let's define the scale of 0.95. Now, if I start hovering over a project, you can see a pop-up animation. There we go. And don't forget to add the opacity -0 here, because as you can see, if I refresh the page, you can see the borderline has been appeared right at the top. So for the initial moment, we got to make this opacity -0. So let's head back to VS Code, and then in here, I'm going to define the opacity -0. There we go. Now everything is working properly. So the next thing that we got to do is to attach this floating image to our mouse cursor. So whenever we are moving our mouse cursor, the preview image will follow. Right at the top, right over here after the text, I'm going to create use GSAP hook by saying use GSAP. And then within the curly brace, I'm going to define GSAP.quick2, GSAP.quick2. The reason why we are using quick2 instead of 2 is that when we are moving our mouse cursor, it always changing its value. So instead of using 2, we are going to use quick2. It is performance friendly for this kind of situation. And then within it, I'm going to select the preview ref.current, and then I'm going to select the x-axis, and then let's say with the duration of 1.5, and then with ease of power 3.out. And let's select all of this and duplicate it again for y-axis. Now this time, this is for y-axis, and let's define the duration to 2 seconds. There we go. And after that, we need to save this GSAPAnimation into a variable. So let's define a variable of const move x equals to use ref, and I'm going to make it null. And let's also define const move y equals to use ref null. Here we go. The reason why we are using this variable is that later on we're going to use the GSAPAnimation in another function. So basically saying we're going to put move x and move y in a function so that we can invoke these animations. And then let's say move x.current equals to this animation. And then for the second one, I'm going to say move y.current equals to this animation again. All right, here we go. Now after that, we got to calculate the mouse movement. So we got to call mouse movement event when the mouse cursor reaches to this container, which is this entire div. So let's head back to VS Code, and then I'm going to give this div, which contains all of the project, on mouse move. And then I'm going to define handle mouse move. Let's define this function. So right below this handle mouse leave, I'll define a const handle mouse move equals to function, and it'll take an event. And then in here, we're going to say, if we are in a desktop mode, we're going to say e.client x plus 24. So we need to say this value for tracking purposes. So right at the top, I'm going to define another useRef by saying const mouse dot useRef, and then I'm going to say property of x position of 0 and y position of 0. All right, and then I'm going to insert this value to mouse dot current dot x equals to this one, and then mouse dot current dot y is equals to e dot client y this time plus 24. And after that, we're going to use those GSAP animation that we have created for move X and move Y in order to smoothly update the preview image position. So let's define those move X dot current. I'm going to insert the updated version of the mouse position dot current dot X. And let's duplicate it. And then this time for Y axis. And then I'm going to define move Y. I wrote it client. Okay. Client X and client Y. We go. I think I had a mistake on typing Y. Yeah, let's make this Y lowercase. Right now, if I start hovering over a project, you will see that the floating image is going to follow my mouse cursor. Here we go. All right, now we are using the top dash 0, so let's turn it back to top dash minus 33 minus top dash 2/6. Here we go. Let's save it again. Beautiful. All right, the final touch that we need to make is to give this project a dark background overlay. So let's create that. All right, now right above the title, I'm going to create a self-closing div, and this will going to represent as the overlay. Now let's give this div a class name of absolute inset -0 and make it hidden for mobile devices, and for large devices for desktop mode, make it visible. And let's also define duration of 200 bg-black minus z-10 clip-path. The clip-path, which is a polygon, which will make this div fully clip at the bottom. All right, here we go. Now I'm going to give this div a ref because we're going to use it for GSAP animation. So let's define the ref equals to a callback function. I'm going to take this current element, which is the current overlay, and then let's define the overlay refs.current with the current index. And then we're going to say element. We're going to set this element into this ref. So let's define this overlay ref. So right at the top, I'm going to define const overlay refs equals to useRef. And for initial value, I'm going to define it as an array. There we go. Let's add some spacing in order to make it readable. All right, here we go. Now what I'm going to do is that, so when the mouse is hovered over a project, we're going to make this background black. In the handle mouse enter, after the set current index, we're going to say const element is equals to overlay refs dot current with the current index. And after that, I'm going to say if that element wasn't available, just return it. And after that, if the element was available, I'm going to use the GSAP dot kill twins, which means that we're going to kill any existing animation on this element. And then I'm going to define GSAP dot from to, and then I'm going to select the element with clip path. I'm going to head to the Clippy website, and then I'm going to define a fully clipped at the bottom. I'm going to copy this and then paste it right over here. And for the to animation, I'm going to set the clip path back to visible. Let's copy this and paste it right over here. And let's add the duration of 0.15 seconds with ease of power 2.out. There we go. So by using this GSAP.from2, we are going to animate overlay from bottom to full reveal. All right, now I'm just going to go ahead and copy all of this and then paste it for the handle mouse leave as well. I'm going to paste it right over here. And for the handle mouse leave, we're going to remove this GSAP from 2, and then I'm going to make the GSAP.to, and then I'm going to define this clip path back to hidden state. So let's copy this polygon and then put it right here. And let's define the duration of 0.2 with ease of power 2.in. There we go. Now let's head back to the project. If I hover over a project, you can see the background overlay. Beautiful, which is coming from the bottom to top. Beautiful. There we go. All right, the final thing that we gotta do is to add a staggering animation for each and every single project. For the first time, when user reaches to this section, the staggering animation kicks in. So for that, inside the use GSAP animation, let's collapse all of the methods in order to make it clean. Inside the use GSAP, I'm going to create a GSAP.from, and then I'm going to select the hashtag project, which is going to select each and every single one of them. You can actually use ref just like here that we have defined, but I prefer use the ID because it is simpler. So in here, I'm going to select the project, and then within the curly brace, I'm going to define y of 100, make the opacity 0, with delay of 0.5, with duration of 1 second, with stagger of 0.3, with ease of back dot out, and let's apply the scroll trigger, and then in here I'm going to say trigger it when the user reaches to that specific project. There we go. And if I refresh the page, you can see that staggering animation going to happen. There we go. Beautiful. All right, now we are done creating with the work section, and you can also observe it for mobile version. Beautiful. All right, now we have completed the works.jsx. So the next section that we are going to build is the contact summary section. In the contact summary section, we are trying to design to inspire action in order to invite our clients to contact us. So for that, I'm going to open up the Explorer, and in the sections folder, I'll create a new file, and I'm going to call it contact summary.jsx. And then let's run refce. As usual, I'm going to remove the import React. Let's add this component into app.jsx. And right below this works, I'm going to add contact summary. There we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove some of the tabs that we don't need to. There we go. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to replace this div with section. And then I'm going to give this section a ref for animation purposes. And I'm going to say container ref. Let's define this container ref by saying const container ref equals to use ref. Now I'm going to give this section a class name of flex-call items-center justify-between mean h-screen gap-12 margin top-16. All right, and after that, within this div, we are going to define the marquee. So I'm just going to add the comment here, and after that, I'm going to create a div, and within it, let's define a paragraph, and then let's say let's build a, I'm going to add the BR for the break, and after that I'm going to create a span, and then within it let's say memorable, and let's also create a span again, and this time we're going to say inspiring. Let's add the breakpoint, and then we're going to say web application. Let's also create a span again, and I'm going to say together, and at the end I'm going to add the closing quote. There we go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this div a class name of overflow-hidden and make it font-light, and let's say text-center and contact-text-responsive. And I'm going to give this memorable span a class name of font-normal, and then let's define this second span. For the inspiring span, I'm going to give this class name of italic, and then for the together, I'm going to define a class name of text-gold. There we go. Actually, mistyped to text-center. Text-center. There we go. Now below this div, we're going to use the marquee again. So I'm going to add the comment of marquee here. There we go. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to create a new file in a components folder, and I'm going to call it marquee.jsx. And let's run refce. And then let's remove the import React from React. And after that, let's add this component to contact summary.jsx. So in the contact summary, we're going to define the marquee. There we go. We're going to give this marquee an item so that we can load our items for the marquee animation. So let's define the items. So right at the top, I'm going to say const items equals to array of string. And then I'm going to say innovation, precision, trust, and then collaboration. Let's also say excellence. All right, now let's head back to the marquee.jsx, and then we're going to take that parameter of items. There we go. After that, let's head back to our project so that we can see the marquee animation that we have created. Here we go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this div a ref equals to container ref. Let's define it. Const container ref equals to use ref null. And then let's give this div a class name of, we're going to use string manipulation here in order to make it dynamic so that we can add class name from the outside. So for that, I'm going to give this a new property of class name. And then for the default value, I'm going to define text-white and bg-black. All right, now let's give this div a class name of overflow-hidden w-full and make the h-20. For medium and large devices, make the height of 100 pixel. And then let's make it flex, items-center, marquee, text-responsive, font-light, and let's also make it uppercase. And finally, white space dash no wrap. Now after that, I'm going to define a $, and then let's add that class name property right here. There we go. Now what I'm going to do next is within the div, I'm going to define another div, and then we're going to iterate through the items dot map, which will return a span, and then for the parameter, we will take a text with index, and then within the span, I'm going to get each and every single text, and then after that, we're going to use icon for spacing. So let's define the icon from iconify, and then we're going to get the icon from the outside again. So let's define the icon, and then we're going to get class name from outside again. Icon class name. So let's define those properties. I'm going to go ahead and give this an icon. For the default value, I'm going to say mdi star-4-points. And after that, let's define the icon class name equals to an empty, nothing. And then let's add the reverse property in order to make it reverse. And for initial value, I'm going to say false. There we go. Now let's give the span a class name of flex, items-center, padding x-16, gap-x-32. And then I'm going to give this div a class name of flex. There we go. And also don't forget to add the key equals to index. And let's define a ref for the span for marquee animation purposes. So I'm going to take this span and it'll return the items ref.current with the current index equals to element. And right at the top, let's define that items refs by saying const items ref equals to use ref, and it is an array. All right, now let's go ahead and add the GSAP animation from GSAP. So if you open up the browser and search for GSAP marquee animation, and if you click on the GSAP marquee animation from green sock, you will see a bunch of marquee animation, just like so. But in this project, we are going to use this GSAP animation. When you're scrolling up and down, the marquee animation goes fast, and when you stop scrolling, it slows down. If you click on this JS tab, we're going to copy the horizontal loop, which is the main function for this marquee effect. So let's find the horizontal loop. Right here, we're going to copy this function horizontal loop. There we go. Now let's head back to VS Code. After this use ref, I'm going to paste the function right over here. And then I'm going to go ahead and collapse this function. Now let's head back to the GSAP website. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy this const.tl and observer.create. Now after that, so I'm going to create the use effect hook. And then we're going to call this use effect whenever we have updated the items or we change the reverse value. All right. Now within the curly brace, I'm going to paste all of those information right here. So right now in the horizontal loop function, which is going to take that item. So I'm going to delete this, and then I'm going to add the items ref.current, which is we are going to select each and every single item. This is the configuration property. And then I'm just going to add a reverse config here by saying reverse. I'm going to set the value of the reverse. There we go. Now after that, we're going to return and kill that timeline animation. tl.kill. So let's import the observer and a GSAP. So right at the top, I'm going to say GSAP from GSAP.register plugin. I'm going to add the observer from GSAP/all. Now, if I scroll it down, you will see a marquee animation. Here we go. Beautiful. So let's head back to the contact summary.jsx and create the another marquee effect. So I'm going to define the marquee, and then let's give this items of, so let's define the items first. Items 2 equals 2. And this time we're actually inviting our clients to contact us by saying contact us. I'm going to duplicate it. 1, 2, 3. All right, now let's add this. There we go. Let's scroll it down. There we go. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to set the reverse to true. Here we go. And after that, I'm going to give this class name of text-black in order to make the text black. And let's give this background of transparent. And let's say border-y-2. There we go. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to give this icon class name stroke-gold stroke-2 text-primary. There we go. And then let's define the icon of material-symbol-light square. Now let's refresh the page. I mistyped the stroke. Let's add the E for the stroke. All right, here we go. Now let's refresh the page. Beautiful. There's a minor issue here that you can see that for the first moment, when you are not scrolling up and down, it is reversed. But when you start scrolling, you will see that the reverse animation has been changed. So we don't want that. So let's fix that issue. So let's head to the marquee effect. And then inside the use effect, we're going to define if it is reversed or not. So I'm going to say if it is not reverse and this, use this. And let's also add the another operation by saying or if it was reversed and self.delta y was larger than 0 and this one. So let's refresh the page. Now you can see that we have fixed that issue. Here we go. All right, now let's head back to the contact summary.jsx. Now the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to give this section a GSAP animation. I'll create a use GSAP hook. Here we go. And within the curly brace, I'm going to define GSAP.to. Let's add the GSAP properly first. .to container ref. We're going to select the container ref.current. And after that, let's define a curly brace again. And then within it, I'm going to define scroll trigger. And then let's say trigger it when you see the container ref.current. And then I'm going to go ahead and define the start, center. And then let's define the end plus equals 800 center. And then I'm just going to go ahead and define a scrub 0.5. And let's set the pin to true and pin spacing to true as well. So let's refresh the page. Now we can see that it is pinned. So what does this GSAP animation do? So in here, we're going to select this container ref.current. So whenever user reaches to this container ref, triggers it. And for the start, if I give this a marker, you will see this end and the start position of our container. And then we set the scrolling position to center. As you can see, it's center. And then basically saying when the center of the container reaches to the center of the viewport, start it. And it's gonna be pinned. And after that, we added plus equals 800 pixel, which is considered 800 more pixel of the container. When it reaches to the center of the viewport, it is going to be stopped. Beautiful. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this marker false so we don't see this markers. All right, here we go. So let's see how does it look like in the desktop mode. Refresh it. There we go. Beautiful. All right, the last and final section that we are going to build is the contact section. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and open up the Explorer, and in the sections folder, I'll create a new file and I'm going to call it contact.jsx. Let's close the Explorer, and in here, I'm going to run refc. And after that, let's close up some of the tabs that we don't need to use. Here we go. And after that, I'm going to remove the import React from React. And then I'm going to replace this div with section. I'm going to give this ID of contact so that our navbar can track it. And let's give this section a class name of flex-call justify-between -h-screen, and finally bg-black. All right, now let's add this component into app.jsx. So let's head back to app.jsx. Now in this component, I'm gonna remove these sections because we don't need them anymore. And then we're gonna add contact. There we go. Now let's head back to contact.jsx. And within this section, I'm gonna go ahead and create a div. And within the div, I'm gonna add the animated header section. So let's do that. Animated header section. There we go. And then what I'm going to do next is I'm going to copy this animated header section from works.jsx. So let's head to works.jsx, and then I'm going to copy this because I'm lazy. And then after that, I'm going to replace this subtitle to "You dream it, I code it." That much you're confident about your work. And let's also add the text so that we get rid of the errors. So I'm going to say const text equals to dynamic string. Got a question, discuss further. Now let's scroll down. Now we can see the contact section is right over here. So we need to change the text color. So I'm going to give this text -white. And let's also change the works to contact. There we go. And below this animated header section, I'll create a new div. And this div is going to contain our email, phone number, and the social media's link. All right. Now I'm going to give this class name flex, padding x-10, font-light, text-white. Let's also make it uppercase. And for large devices, make it text-32 pixel. For default value, I'm going to say text-26 pixel, leading-none, and margin bottom -10. And within this div, I'll create another div, and I'm going to give this div a class name of flex-cool, w-full, and also gap-10. And then below this div, I'll create another div, and this time within it, I'll create the h2 tag. And within the h2 tag, I'm going to say email. And then I'm going to give this div a class name of social-link. Here we go. If I hover my mouse over the social link, you can see that nothing happens. Because instead of using ref or ID, this time I'm going to give this class name so that we can select this specific class name and start animating this div. All right, now below this h2 tag, I'm going to go ahead and create a self-closing div in order to make a line. So I'm going to give this div a class name of w-full h-1 pixel and margin y-2, and let's also say bg-white with opacity of 30. And below this div, let's create a paragraph, and then I'm going to say johndoe@gmail.com. And let's also give this paragraph a class name of text-xl tracking-wider, make it lowercase, and for medium and large devices, make it text-2xl, and for large devices, make it text-3xl. All right, now below this div, I'll create another div, and I'm gonna give this div a class name of social-link again for animation purposes. And within the div, I'll create the h2 tag, and I'm gonna say phone. And below this h2 tag, I'm gonna go ahead and add this line. And then I'm going to create a paragraph with a class name of text-xl lowercase. For medium and large devices, make it text-2xl. And for large devices, make it text-3xl. And then I'm going to add my phone number. I'm going to say 33 7 12 12 32 12. And let me also mention this. Don't try to call this phone number because I'm not going to answer. It is fake, by the way. And below this div, I'll create a new div. And I'm going to give this class name of social link. And then within it, let's create the h2 tag. And I'm going to say social media. Here we go. And let's add this line again. And then let's create a div this time, not a paragraph. And then let's give this div a class name of flex-wrap, and then gap-2. All right, now we are going to iterate through the socials link by adding the socials right at the top. So let's import socials from constant. And right below, within this div for the social media, I'm going to iterate through the socials by saying socials.map, and it'll take a social with index, and then it'll return a anchor tag. Here we go. And let's also define this anchor tag by saying social.name. And let's also add the curly brace by adding this curly brace. Let's also do it for the other side. Here we go. Now I'm going to give this anchor tag a key equals to an index, and then let's also define the href equals to social.href, and then with a class name of text-extra small, leading-loose, tracking-widest. Let's make it uppercase, and then for medium and large devices, make it text-sm. All right, now let's add the hover -text-white/ 80. And then let's add transition dash colors with duration of, for example, 200. There we go. Beautiful. All right, the final element that we are going to add in this project is the marquee animation. So I'm just going to go ahead and collapse all of this div, which contains the animated header section and the contact information. So let's close this up. Below this div, I'm going to go ahead and add the marquee over here. And let's define the items. So right at the top, I'm going to say const items equals to just imaginary code. By adding this, we are showing that how confident we are. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and select all of this and duplicate it. Here we go. Now for the marquee, I'm going to add the items equals to items. Here we go. Now let's scroll it down. All right. And I'm going to give this marquee a class name of text-white bg-transparent. There we go. All right, now whenever you see the issue with the marquee animation, just refresh the page. There we go. Now what we are going to do next is we are going to add this contact information animation. So right above this return type, I'll create use GSAP hook. And then within the curly brace, I'm going to say GSAP, make sure you add it properly, GSAP.from, and then I'm going to select the social links by saying dot social dash link. And then I'm going to go ahead and define a curly brace again. And then within it, I'm going to define the y-axis of 100. And let's also make the opacity 0. And with delay of 0.5, duration of 1 second, and stagger equals to 0.3. With ease of back out. And let's also add scroll trigger. And we're going to say trigger it when user reaches the social link, social dash link. Here we go. Now let's refresh the page. Beautiful. And finally, let's add this GSAPAnimation, a adding dependency. All right, there we go. All right, now the additional thing that we are going to do is to make a loading animation, because all of the awards-winning website has their own loading page. So let's create a loading page for our portfolio. So for that, I'm going to open up the app.jsx, and in here, we are going to define loading state based on this 3D model. So let me put it this way. If this website is published, this model needs time in order to get loaded. So this 3D model needs to be downloaded. All right, now based on the download progress, we're going to create loading state by using this 3D model progress. So how we can do that? We can actually achieve this by using use progress from React Three Drei. So right above the return, I'll create const progress. I'm going to call it progress. You have to define it within the curly brace. Equals to use progress. This progress going to track the initial downloading process numbers. So if I add this inside a console log, and if I open up the dev tool, you will see the progress of loading this 3D model. All right, now based on this information, we're going to create loading page. All right, let's create a use state hook. And I'm going to say const is ready. And for initial value, I'm going to set it to false. Let's define the use state. There we go. Now after that, we're going to create the use effect hook. And within the curly brace, I'm going to say if progress was 100% completed, then set is ready to true. And let's also add when we have the progress value, run this use effect. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this entire sections inside a div. So let's do that by creating a div, and I'm going to give this div a class name of, let's make it dynamic, $, curly brace, and we're going to say if is ready was true, make the opacity -100, make it visible, otherwise make the opacity 0. And then we're going to give this transition opacity with duration of 1 second. All right, now right above this div, I'm going to say if is ready was false if the 3D model was loading. So we're going to return this div, and I'm going to give this div a class name of fixed inset-0 z-999 in order to make it always top over the other elements. And then let's also define it flex-cool items-center justify-center. Let's also make the bg-black and text-white and transition-opacity with duration of 700. And let's also say font-light. And within the div, let's create a paragraph. And I'm going to give this paragraph a class name of margin bottom-4 text-xl tracking-widest. And then we're going to say animate-pause. And then within the paragraph, we're going to say loading math.floor progress in order to make the numbers rounded. And after that, below this paragraph, I'll create another div. All right, now before I continue creating this, I've noticed that I mistyped the is ready. So let's fix that. I'm gonna put the Y at the end. So for the moment, I'm gonna make this true so that we can see this div element. All right, now let's continue creating this div. This div will be used as a loading progress bar. So I'm going to give this div a class name of relative, make it h-1, make it overflow-hidden, make it rounded, w-60, and finally bg-white with the opacity of 20. Now within this div, I'll create another div, and then I'm going to give this div a class name of absolute top-0 and left-0 h-full transition-all with duration of 300 and make it bg-white. And then I'm going to add the style width, and then I'm going to say get that progress percentage. Here we go. Now let's turn this true back to is ready. Now if I refresh the page, you can see the loading animation page. All right, here we go. All right, now we are completely done with creating this project. Great job.